All right, it's bonus sermon time, and we're going to talk about the story of Jepthah. Jepthah comes from Judges 10 through 12, and is a story that gets mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. He's one of our heroes of faith, which is really most of the struggle, because he's not much of a good guy. The main thing to remember about Jepthah is his greatest moral failure, and so that's a struggle for us. But we'll do what we can with Jepthah and try to at least give you some options for thinking about him today. So Judges chapter 10, it's the same story we know from every story in Judges. Verse 6, Israel returns to serving idols. So verse 7 and 8, the Ammonites come in and oppress Israel for 18 years. Verse 10, the people cry out to God for help. This part is actually one of the better renditions of the Judges cycle, because of the way it plays it out. In verses 11 through 14, God just reminds them of all the times they've already sinned and done this, and he very kindly suggests they go to one of their pagan gods for help, and even goes so far as to say, you should probably stop praying to me now, because you've picked other gods. We're done. It seems like a really bad breakup. And then in verses 15 and 16, Israel puts away their gods anyway, even though God says, go talk to them. They take it as sarcasm, and they decide to go ahead and put away the gods anyway. They pray to God, and God says, yeah, okay, one more time. And so the cycle repeats itself, and God comes to save them. In verse 17, there are two armies that are going to face off. We have the Israelite army, and we have the Ammonites. But the problem is one of leadership. The Israelites at this time don't have someone that they can really trust to lead successfully a military campaign against the Ammonites. So they go looking for somebody. Who is the man who shall begin to fight against the Ammonites? He shall be head over all the inhabitants of Gilead. Right? We're looking for a warlord. We're looking for a king, general, somebody who can really champion our cause out there, or we're not going to win because they're too powerful. Geography lesson, just real quick. This story is taking place over on the east side of Jordan, in the place on the map on the screen that says Ammon, over by the Jabbok River. The fort of Jabbok is where Jacob wrestles with the angel. So if you want to contextualize it, it's over in that part of the world. But what's important is our hero, the battle is in the area of Mizpah, but our hero is actually from Tob. They don't have a general at Mizpah. That's where the battle's going down. They go all the way out to Tob. Tob is, I don't know that it's actually in Israel specifically. It's out east in kind of the no man's land, the wild lands, northeast of Israel. And that's where we find Jepthah. That's not a good place to find Israel's future king and leader in general, right? Is somewhere other than Israel, but that's where we're going to go. So chapter 11, we get introduced to Jepthah. He is mighty, so if that's what we're looking for, check, we got that. In all other senses, he is not an ideal leader. Let's look at his resume real quick in verses 1 through 3. He is the son of a prostitute. Always a good start for a political campaign to have that as your lineage. He's the son of a prostitute. He was disinherited and chased off in disgrace by his kinsmen. He moved to Tob, where he joined a cohort of what the text calls worthless fellows. He joins a gang. He joins a marauding band of looters and plunderers. He could have easily been part of the problem. They're just out there causing mischief. That's our man Jepthah, right? He is the black sheep of Israel's family. He has already been run out of town because he's no good. And yet, he's powerful and strategic and warrior-like enough that people remember him. And in their time of peril, they say, you know who we really need? We need Jepthah. That's our guy. So verses 4 through 6, the people decide they're so desperate for a leader that they appeal to Jepthah. Jepthah says in verse 7, aren't you the same people that ran me off? Why are you coming and asking me to lead you? And they make no excuse. They just openly say, yeah, we know we did that, but we're really desperate. We're in a lot of trouble, and if we didn't have to have you as our leader, you wouldn't be our leader, but we have to have you. So verses 9 through 11, Jepthah then says, okay, I'll lead, but the deal is I actually have to be the leader. I can't be the kind of leader You can't say I'm the leader and then go have a meeting and then tell me that you're reversing all my decisions. I am actually in charge, and you'll do whatever I say, and I'll lead your armies against the Ammonites. They agree, and the war is on. The end of chapter 11 is kind of funny from a historical point of view, but probably not for anybody else, so I'll just quickly summarize it. The emissaries from the Amorites and the Ammonites have this discussion with Jepthah about who's right in this war. And it's kind of funny. The Amorite king explains his justification. You kicked us out of our land. Well, Jepthah says, yeah, but before that, you had been unkind to us when we came out of Egypt. And then our God gave us your land. He says in verses 23 and 24, if Chemosh, your God, gave you a land, wouldn't you take it? Well, our God gave us your land, and so we took it. So if you read the story, it's a discussion about like 300 years of backstory, arguing which group actually has the right to be on the moral high ground in this argument. Here's what I conclude, because they end up fighting anyway. If you want a war, the reasons don't matter, right? I mean, you can go back and say, well, you wronged me here, and then, yeah, but you wronged me over there. If you want to fight, you're going to fight. It doesn't actually matter what the reason is. But they're going to spend 27 verses arguing about it anyway, because that's what we do. Because everybody wants to feel like they're on the moral high ground. Like, we're the good guys in this battle. Fact is, in any conflict, at least somebody's wrong. Maybe both. In this case, they decide to fight anyway. It doesn't matter. So chapter 11 and verse 31 is where the story really gets fascinating for us, and we're going to pause and really dig into this. It really depends on what translation you read or even what commentary you check as to what you read here. But the short version is that Jepthah makes a vow before he goes to battle. He promises God, if you will bring me back home again safely from battle, I will something. And the something is the debate. The NRSV says, then whoever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return victorious from the Ammonites, shall be the Lord's, to be offered up by me as a burnt offering. The ESV says, then whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. And then there are some commentators, historically notable would be Adam Clarke, the great Methodist commentators from a century ago. He said, he translates it as, I will consecrate it to the Lord, or I will burn it, burnt offering. My point is that the Hebrew there is really tricky. What is it that Jepthah actually promises to do? It's not clear. And then to make matters worse, the story that follows is just vague enough where whichever interpretation you favor, you can kind of make that work in the details that follow. The way the story goes is that the following scene, Jepthah is victorious. He comes home, and the first thing that comes out of his house when he returns is a person. It's not just a person, it's his child. It's not just his child, it's his only child, his only daughter, who is known to us as Jepthah's daughter. That's her name. So she comes out, and Jepthah, is greatly distressed. He has made this vow that he feels like he can't break. And so as the text goes on, the daughter says, well, give me 2 months to bemoan my virginity, and then you should keep your vow. And then the text says he kept his vow. So what's weird about that is it doesn't give you any details as to what he actually did. The text just over and over again says, and so he did according to his vow. But we weren't really clear what the vow was to start with. So you end up with 3 different renderings of what happens. I'm going to give you all 3, and at the end give you my 2 cents. I think they're all interesting, some more than others. Version 1. This is kind of the Adam Clarke version. This is the best case scenario. You could translate Judges 11:31, I will consecrate it to the Lord, or I will offer a burnt offering. And if you read it that way, what Jepthah says is, depending on what comes out of my house, I'll either dedicate it to God, or I'll offer it as a burnt sacrifice. Why would you think he meant that? Well, Adam Clarke explains it like this. If a dog had met him, this could not have been made a burnt offering. Right? I mean, that's not the kind of thing the book of Leviticus says you're supposed to do. And if his neighbor or his friend's wife, son or daughter had been returning from a visit to his family, he wouldn't have been allowed to offer his friend's son or child as a burnt offering. Well, okay, that's true. Besides, human sacrifices were ever an abomination to the Lord, and this is one of the grand reasons why God drove out the Canaanites, because they offered their sons and daughters to Molech in the fire, made burnt offerings of them, as is generally supposed. Right? So again, Clark's point is, everything we know about God and everything we know about Leviticus and everything we know about the sacrificial system of the Old Testament says that no one in their right mind thinks God is going to accept a human sacrifice. In fact, it's one of the things that makes God really angry when people offer up child sacrifices. So it's weird to assume that that's what happened here. Instead, what Clark thinks happens is that Jepthah said, or. Either I'll consecrate it to God, or I'll make a burnt sacrifice. When his daughter comes out, he picked the first one, not to sacrifice her as a burnt offering, but to consecrate her to God. This, you may remember in the story of Samuel, is what Hannah does. In 1 Samuel 1:11, she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant, and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. So what she ends up doing is taking Samuel and consecrates him to the Lord. She doesn't offer him as burnt sacrifice. She consecrates him to the Lord, and he lives at the tabernacle with Eli the priest. She doesn't set him on fire as burnt offering. She gives him to the Lord. So he doesn't grow up in her home as a son. Her son is now a servant of the tabernacle of the priesthood. Yeah, it's possible. What reasons would you have to think that's true? Again, it's more consistent with what we read in the Bible in the sense of, remember the story of Abraham in Genesis 22? God says, offer up your son Isaac. And then Abraham gets ready to do it, and God says, stop, don't do that. Right? That's not okay. And so some would have said, it's kind of weird that here apparently God's okay with it. This might explain how Jepthah gets included in Hebrews chapter 11 as a faithful example to us all. It would be a strange place to put a guy who set his daughter on fire. Okay, so that's entirely possible. And then if you finish the story, it never actually says he kills her. It's weird. The wording is funny. It never says she dies. Verse 36 says, do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth. And in verse 39, her father who did with her according to the vow he had made. Like it specifically avoids ever saying she died. We just kind of assume that's what it meant and that he set her on fire. And so best case scenario would be this, that Jepthah is not a horrible human being. He instead is still sad. I mean, it's still tragic, right? His daughter goes off and lives at the tabernacle or something like that as a servant of the priesthood. She's a virgin. She doesn't have a family, right? He doesn't have any grandkids. I mean, the whole line of Jepthah comes to an end. It's still tragic, but she doesn't die. That's best case scenario. It's not the only possibility. The fact is, essentially no major translation translates it that way, because most of the translators feel that that's wishful thinking. Is it permissible by the Hebrew grammar? It is. It's allowable. But most translators view it to be unlikely. So the ESV tries it like this. Then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the Ammonites, shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. We're going to call this the unintended consequences view. And what Jepthah says is, whatever comes out, he's thinking it's going to be like a cow. He's thinking it's going to be some livestock. Remember, people live with their animals. Whatever comes out first, whatever I see first, that's what I'll sacrifice. And I'm going to make a burnt offering of it. But lo and behold, he says whatever, it turns out to be whoever. The first thing he sees is his daughter. And so he's made a rash vow. Okay? In this reading that the ESV favors, Jepthah is a foolish man. That makes sense. Remember, he's not a nice guy. He's been living with bandits out at Tob, right? We went and got him. He's already been disinherited and thrown out of Israel. So we shouldn't expect him to be a paragon of virtue and wisdom. So it could have been he made a stupid decision. Notice You don't have to explain what God thinks about it because the text never tells you what God thinks about it. God didn't ask him to make a vow. God didn't tell him to keep the vow. It's Jepthah who makes the vow, and it's Jepthah that says, well, I can't break a vow to God. God doesn't say that. Listen, future reference. If you ever make a promise to God to go murder someone, God's okay if you don't keep that promise, right? Don't murder anyone. I mean, that's just go without saying. If you promise to do something evil to God, God would just prefer you broke your promise and not did something evil. And so there's nothing in this text where God says, yeah, well, you said it, you got to go kill her, right? So that's pretty important. In fact, I think it's important to notice throughout the Bible, God just doesn't deal in deals. You never see stories where God says, well, if you'll do this, then I'll do this. If you'll love me this much, I'll love you that much. It's just not the way it works. Jepthah thinks it does. This is all Jepthah. So that's another way of reading the story that is pretty consistent and would make a lot of sense. Which brings us to option number 3. And this is the New Revised Standard. In that translation, they go all the way, worst case scenario. They translate it as, then whoever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return victorious from the Amorites, shall be the Lord's, to be offered up by me as a burnt offering. We're going to call this the worst case scenario view. In this case, Jepthah fully expects to make a human sacrifice. Whoever comes out, not whatever, whoever comes out. He's expecting a servant or a slave or somebody he doesn't care about to come out of his house first, and then he's going to kill that person and offer that person to God, because Jepthah apparently thinks God's into that. And that's a really dark reading of the story. It's not impossible. It's certainly, the text permits it, the New Revised Standard buys into it as a translation. It fits in the overall theme of Judges. That is, the end of Judges, which we're getting close to, is a really sad story. All kinds of terrible things happen. We studied Samson this morning. It's not pleasant. Maybe this is part of that. Jepthah isn't a good man. We already know that. Neither is Samson. The Jewish traditional interpretation that you find in some of the Midrash actually favors this view. And they say Jephthah's daughter acts on purpose. She knew what her dad was planning to do. And rather than let a servant go out first, she goes out first and kind of puts her hands on her hips and says, now what? And that's why her dad is so angry. In one of the Jewish Midrash, she says, Jacob promised to give a tithe of all that he owned. He didn't have to give one of his sons. So why did you think you had to make a human sacrifice? In one of the Jewish interpretations, the 2 months where she is mourning her virginity, it says that she goes to the Jewish leadership and pleads her case and says, this is stupid, why is he doing this? But again, that's just traditional interpretations. So that version of it is really bad. Like, he's a very evil man. And that could be it. It would not shock me to find out he's an evil man. The only problem I have with it is still Hebrews 11, that celebrates him as a man of faith. I struggle a little bit to find the faith in this story, if that's who he is as a person. But maybe it's still there. Well, so what happens? What's Ben's conclusion? Drum roll, please. What's the right answer? It may not surprise you to find out. I think it doesn't matter. The irony of the story is that Jepthah made a vow to secure his victorious return to his family and home. He did not trust the Spirit of the Lord that was on him in the same verse 29, to provide victory without further assurance. He wanted to make a deal with God. In a sense, he's trying to manipulate God. Give me what I want and I'll give you what you want. And that's just not the way it's supposed to work. That's not obedience. That's manipulation. The cost of his vow was his only daughter. And it actually doesn't matter whether she goes to live at the tabernacle as a servant, or he sets her on fire but didn't want to, or he sets her on fire and was thrilled, right? It doesn't actually matter to the point of the story, is that his family ended that day. He made a deal with God so that his family line would continue on and be blessed because of this great victory. And instead, because of that same deal, he lost his family. That's the story. And it's a rash vow, however you spin it. I think the moral is, don't bargain with God. He doesn't like it when you do that. Obey God. Don't try to manipulate God into doing what you want. I don't believe God approves of the vow. I don't even think God approves of how he kept the vow, regardless of what he actually did. The moral is, this is how you obey God. It's not, I'll do what you say if. It's just, I'll do what you say.